Hey everyone, I'm Luke Teschler, here with Shomik Ghosh, and this is GNT Film Review, Episode 1, Memoria.
So today, Luke, we are discussing a film that we saw on the 29th down in the Village, Memoria, and a very strange experience.
It's a wild movie. There's really no way to describe it, although, we're obviously going to do the best to do what we can. But it's a bizarre film. It's an experience of a film. Why don't we start off with just the log line for this movie to contextualize here what we're working with. So the log line is a bewildering drama about a Scottish woman who, after a loud bang at daybreak, begins experiencing a mysterious sensory syndrome while traversing the jungles of Colombia.
Yeah.
That's it.
That conveys some of the mystery of this film, but if only, this is previewing a bit of where we're going, if only the film focused on that more, this mysterious bang and what develops, I think you have a real, winner. And so Memoria is directed by Apichatpong Weerasethakul, and he's kind of I don't know how you describe it, he's a director. I mean, his last two films, I think, have had phenomenal runs at Cannes. Uncle Boomy, who can recall his past lives, won the Palme d'Or in 2010. Tropical Malady won the jury prize at Cannes. And so he's at the helm. And then the cast is, it's led by Tilda Swinton. And it's we'll talk about this more. It's an anchor role for her. It's a central role. And then she's supported by a pretty phenomenal group of Latin American actors. And they probably won't be too familiar to Western audiences, but the performances are, I think, for the most part, very deep and textured and looks great. I think when we were talking about when we left the cinema, this is Swinton's role. I mean, she is asked to do a lot, and I think she does it.
She does it exceptionally. It's a powerhouse performance, and I think we'll talk about this as we go on, but Shomik, there's not a lot of dialogue in this movie, so it's incredibly difficult to convey the level of emotion she's conveying without even speaking in multiple scenes. So it's a fantastic performance. I should say that in reading a little bit about the movie, she also was involved pretty heavily in coming up with this story, in finding Bogota as a place to shoot, and kind of developing the themes in working through the vision of the movie. So having heard that, it's not surprising that, as you mentioned, she's the anchor of the film, right? Because she definitely had a large part of the vision and the creative process in terms of helming the overall narrative.
So, Luke, I maybe we begin by first you giving your thoughts. I'll give mine. We can go into some more textured analysis of the film.
Sure. So it's really hard to describe this movie. As I mentioned, I think the primary adjective I would use is perplexing, and I was perplexed throughout the entire time I watched it. But that's not to say it was a bad experience. I think my reaction to the film kind of shifted throughout, from being engrossed to somewhat bored to confused. And again, I think that's the goal of the filmmaker here. You mentioned disorientation. And I think a large part of the movie is trying to have the viewer experience disorientation. And in that sense, I think it excels perfectly. And that's why I like the movie. I mean, listen, I'll be frank, it's not an easy hang. It's not an entertaining movie. It's not a particularly densely plotted movie. But at the same time, it kind of washes over you and gives you a feeling like not many contemporary movies do. And in that respect, I left the theater and I thought about it a lot. And that's kind of, for me, always the mark of what is, I think, a really good film. So, despite the difficulties with it, I think it was really quite an accomplishment. And the more I think about it, the more I really, really enjoyed the film.
Yeah. So I had a bit of a different view, although to your point, I did think about it a lot after we saw it. Recently I've been in this mind state where I feel more and more frustrated when films scratch at the surface of a deep, meaningful plot with characters who really develop and storylines that unfold for the viewer, but come up short. And oftentimes what I think and what I feel is that it's much easier to create the mystery than to solve it. It's much easier to intrigue the audience than to satisfy the audience with a great ending. And oftentimes the way out is to just be very atmospheric and strange and leave everybody on a cliff. And if you have the credentials, and clearly this team does, almost you just rely on the critics and the audience, assume they miss something deeper that you really understand. And to me, this is the type of film where I suspect they have no idea what it's about either, if they really were honest about it, because I've read it's about ecology, I've read about, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but maybe extraterrestrial, but I think that this is really much more meandering and unfocused, and for me that's frustrating because this film requires a lot of investment by the audience to get to the end. And we'll talk about that more when we discuss the techniques here, but it's long shots that can really take time. You'll just be sitting, staring at something without any audio, any dialogue for multiple minutes. I think when and you can get audiences to do it, but I think there needs to be a payoff. And I found the lack of it in the plot, I think the plot is the weakest point here, to be very frustrating. The good side of it is it's really uniquely shot. You don't see, I was making a comment earlier about Danny Boyle and Aaron Sorkin, this quick cut shots. That's not happening. This is completely, elegiac. It just takes a long view of each of these images that the director puts together. And it's very, poignant in a way, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat. And then there's other times where it's almost like he plays the trick once too many. There's one scene, an apocryphal scene with the band that we'll talk about. It just feels too much like, this is a trick rather than his actual focus. So all in all, it's a gorgeous film, certainly intriguing. It will make you think about what you saw. The frustrating part is you may end up suspecting no one knows, and it's just kind of a waste of time. So I was a little bit more ambivalent about the film than you were.
Sure. So in terms of a score here, I'm going to give it a 7.4, mostly because of what I've already said, right? Which is that I think it's an incredibly unique movie. It's an incredibly ambitious movie, and it's an experiential movie at its heart, right? It makes you feel something or feel like you are in a place or in an emotional state in a way that not many movies can do. But in response to your point about plot, I think you're absolutely right. I think if you asked both Swinton or Joe, which is what the director goes by as short, kind of what the movie is about or to explain the ending, I agree with you. I'm not sure they could give you a really crisp, clean answer. And I think part of the reason is because really in making the film, they did not focus on character and they did not focus on narrative. I think the goal was really to convey a feeling, which of course is going to be difficult with people. And it's really not the type of filmmaking that we're used to, because it is unanchored from plot and it is unanchored from character. I will say that he doesn't make any bones about it, right? Like within, the first 5 minutes of the movie are basically a dark room with a person waking up. You can barely see the person's face. It's shot from behind Tilda Swinton. So you see the back of her head in a dark room waking up. You hear a loud noise. And then immediately after that, he basically cuts to a parking lot. And he has a dolly shot going down a parking lot with a bunch of car lights and car alarms going off for about at least 2 minutes, I want to say, right? So, he makes no bones about the fact that this is what the movie is going to be like. And from the gate what you're signing up for, but I hear the complaints loud and clear. I mean, it's a tough hang at times.
I think that's right. I mean, he has a vision. There's no doubt. It's just the question of whether I think the story catches up to the technical prowess, as well as I think the almost general aesthetic. I think it's just that the vision, he could have told that story and had all the scenes you mentioned, but tightened it out to the actual broader plot line, where the answer you get is so mysterious and strange. We're not trying to give away a major spoiler. You end up, for me, feeling cheated out of it. So for that, I'm going to go a little lower than you at a 5.1. I think it's perfectly good. It's a fine effort, but it's not the type of thing that you walk out, at least to me, and say, I just saw something like profoundly moving or really that's changing the way I think about things.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. for most people who are going to watch the movie. And I think a large part of that score, I would imagine, is because the third act didn't land.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the third act a little bit later as the podcast goes on. But basically, I think your reaction to the movie is really going to come down to whether the third act lands or not. And there are a lot of reasons why, for many people, I think it won't land, right? But I think I'm fair, or being fair, in saying that the first 2/3 of the movie feels like a kind of interesting, decently plotted mystery, and then you end up leaving Bogota, the city of Bogota, and you land in these Colombian jungles, and all of a sudden it's a question of, wait, where am I? What's happening? Who are these characters, and what am I watching? In a way that, again, is incredibly disorienting, but for many, I think is going to be frustrating too.
Yeah, and even, I think you're absolutely right. First 2 acts, I think it's definitely trending towards a 7.58 category. I think the problem is it all builds. There's a certain linearity to film, unless you're talking about, Memento style where it's a, flashback, etc. So you're expecting those 2 parts to build. There's a character who appears in the first 2 parts to be almost probably the second most important character, who disappears from the entire film in the third part. You just lose him. You don't know what happens to him. And it makes no sense why he would disappear, because he's a part and parcel of the mystery in her business, etc. That's where the unfocused nature comes about. All right, so so you've given our scores. Luke's giving it a 7.4. I'm giving it a 5.1. There's some. We always go back to some questions over and over again when we think about these films. So Luke, I'll pose the first one to you. Why did the film, in your mind, work or didn't work? What is the central problem with the film, or the best feature of it? And what do you think it was trying to say? What do you think the director's trying to get out of the film? And did they do a good job at accomplishing that?
Sure. So I think they did do a good job of accomplishing what they sought out to do. And I think that discussion really needs to begin with, okay, what was the goal of the movie? And in reading a little bit about the production process and how Joe and Tilda came together to make this movie, which was a long time in the making, what I have learned is that their goal of the movie was to basically convey a sense of displacement, right? So Joe has made many films in Thailand, and they wanted to make a film in a different country, in a country neither of them had familiarity with, and basically drop the character in that place with a sense of confusion and displacement. And that goal, combined with a specific experience that Joe had, which is some type of medical syndrome, where he was traveling at one point a few years ago, and he had, I guess, a similar experience where in the morning he would wake up and he would hear these kind of weird, disorienting sounds. And it's a well-recognized medical condition. I don't remember the name of it. And the sounds were not nearly as pronounced as the sounds Tilda Swinton hears in the movie. But it was a combination of his experience with that syndrome and this idea of putting a character in a displaced, unfamiliar place and seeing what happens that kind of drove the movie. So when you look at the film from that perspective, I think it's incredibly successful, because that's what you feel for over 2 hours with the character. And just to kind of put a bow on the point, I did want to read a couple quotes from Tilda Swinton specifically about the goal of the movie and kind of how she approached it, because I do think it contextualizes the movie very well. So 2 quotes, starting with the first one. She says, "The movie is supposed to be, quote, truly experiential. It's not about information. The task is not to deal with the primary narrative pulse, but for the pulse to be about being," close quote. Second quote, "I don't view Jessica as a character. I view her as a predicament," close quote. And I think that really explains the movie, what they're doing, and why I enjoyed it. Because if your goal is to do 2 of those things, I don't think I've seen a movie that has done that nearly as well, or a director who maybe even could do that as well. I mean, it's incredibly successful at conveying those feelings, at just focusing on the fundamental kind of vibrational, emotional core that a person is experiencing when they're in an unfamiliar and confusing place, and they can't seem to get their roots, their grounding, right? They can't seem to return back to a sense of normalcy. And the movie excels at creating that feeling, I think.
I think the second quote you said, Luke, really does contextualize the film well when you think about it in that way. Jessica's not a character, she's a predicament. And the predicament being her hearing this loud, disruptive sound, not being able to place it, no one else hears it, isn't about climate change and ecology. You're many times you'll hear climate activists say, we have an existential crisis right now, and no one cares. There was that Adam McKay movie that came out, same
Don't look up.
So
right.
is the sound that she's more attuned to this broader destruction, deforestation, whatever it is? Maybe. I mean, is it instead the modern condition in a broader sense? We have all of the trappings of modernity, but there's been this profound loss of the individual. Is the sound the alarm, the wake-up call? So to me, that's a great frame. And I will say, thinking of it in that way, you do get more thrust. But again, to me, and this is my answer to what didn't work, the answer they come up with, rather than give you some thesis, some view, instead they kind of give you truly a left field answer a bit. And, without giving away too much, it involves, the broader systems and creatures than Earth. It just doesn't answer it. And that's, to me, the frustration, because I think if they had said, this is a movie about ecology, they can get that answer somehow. And if they said, this is a movie about modern conditions, they can get that answer. And it would be something a viewer could walk away with and really say, oh, that's pretty profound. Instead, to me, it seems like a lot of hand-waving and leaving that part open because you don't want to answer it. And, or
you don't know. You don't even know what you're saying, really, specifically in terms of story, right?
So to me, that's it. I think I agree with you that's the central conceit, though. And I think what's frustrating to me, and maybe for you it actually did pay out more, it's so close to getting there. I just wish it had a little bit more focus. What I will say did work, and we've talked, this is a gorgeous film. I do wish we saw more filmmaking that was this patient with the scenes, with the framing. You'll just sit at a park bench for 5 minutes, and for certain people, that'll drive them insane. But there's an immersiveness that creates into the environment that is, I think, really fundamentally unique. You don't see that often, and it doesn't feel like a heavily cut film.
No.
It doesn't feel made up. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of post-production here. Whether there is or there isn't, what that does, that naturalistic immersion, I think is something missing in a lot of the films we have. And if you watch older films, they're much longer shots generally. That the ability to cut 1,000 times, it detracts from your ability to just kind of soak the viewer in the atmosphere. I really felt, I mentioned earlier, I thought it was in Madrid. I have callbacks to my time I've spent in Spain when I was watching that one scene where the dog follows her. Sure. In particular, I was like, this is I think I've been there. Yeah. That was wonderful. So that's, to me, the kind of pros and the cons there.
So I will say that I agree entirely, and I think that's also why the movie worked, because it is a great marrying of form and function in that respect. I think that if the movie were cut more quickly or had more of a pace to it, it wouldn't necessarily give you the sense of displacement that it's seeking to get, right? I think it's a great marrying of form and function. And, a lot of folks have compared his filmmaking to Tarkovsky's filmmaking. And I'm not sure if you've seen any Tarkovsky films, but in advance of this podcast, I actually watched Stalker last night, and same type of thing. He held on shots for minutes at length, right? And it gives you a fundamental sense of being that allows you to emotionally feel the space, feel the circumstances of the scene in a way that truly is unique, and we don't see a lot of. And I think that's why I like the movie to the extent I did. It felt just very refreshing. It was a refreshing experience.
And there's a tension to it. And we saw it in the theater, a packed theater.
Sold out show.
And we didn't really, it's not a film where there's clear ways to gauge audience reaction. It's not like a comedy where you get the laugh lines. I watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and it was, I could tell the movie was working, because just the way every line delivered, as Tarantino, I'm sure, wanted it to, if you could have guessed it, in a packed Brooklyn crowd. Here it was hard to tell, but I think that's rewarding for a viewer to go through that process of sitting there and testing your own kind of patience. I think the payoff, we maybe have a little bit of disagreement, but that's, it's a great experience to see things in that way, as opposed to kind of almost subconsciously know what you're watching is post-production.
Right.
I just watched Steve Jobs by Danny Boyle, which is why he's on my mind. And it's a wonderful film, but it's must be 50 shots per every, minute. It's he's going so fast. And here, instead, you've got a 10 minutes.
Literally 10 minutes. A camera is just posted in the third act, which we really do need to talk about. But in the third act, it's just a camera set up in a field or a jungle with these two characters, and literally 10 minutes long. Just they're sitting there, no cuts.
And there's another scene which I think we both did not like, but where out of nowhere, he just shows a band in a building that Tilda Swinton's walking to play an entire song, just them. And you're just sitting there like, what the hell's going on? So, is it indulgent? Yes. Is it rewarding? Yes. It's probably both. And that's, good films should probably have those peaks and valleys and leave you open to kind of interpreting both.
For sure. I will say, on the audience reaction point, it is funny. The one reaction that was notable is the movie ended and there was just silence in the theater. Like nobody said a single word. Walking out of the aisle, silence, right? I think it was, and in terms of the refreshing and uniqueness point, I think people just literally didn't know what to do with the movie, ourselves included. We talked about it. We didn't fundamentally know how to process it. We didn't have words at first to put to the film, and I think that's part of the reason why it worked for me, but also part of the reason why it was incredibly frustrating. I will also say on your point about plot, the ecology point is interesting because the movie does make a point of having a specific scene where she's like buying plant equipment because she's a botanist, I believe. Yep. And then in thinking about it more, I have no idea why that scene was in the movie. Like maybe there was a point behind it, but in terms of just plot structure, it's unclear to me at all in terms of why that scene was there or what was happening. So in terms of storytelling, I do think there were some flaws.
It feels disjointed. I felt, to your point, the first two acts were written by the same people. And then the third act, which was written by someone else. To me, that's what it felt like. Because the botany, that other character who she was working with, there's a character who tries to help her identify the sound in a sound studio, but then he ends up offering to fund her botanical research. And they kind of develop, it's not romantic, but it's certainly a mutual interest in each other. They talk about traveling. He wants to go to Tokyo. There's this, and then that drops out. The botany drops out. Everything drops out. And then it's like you have a 45-minute last act where it's all focused on this one other character. There's this, I guess this is a good time to bring it in. I mean, there's clearly a magical realism kind of angle to in that third act. There's this supernatural type character. There's, almost telepathic powers between Tilda Swinton and him. There's aliens. I mean, the whole thing suddenly explodes into this mess. And they leave behind the rest of the story, for better or for worse. Right.
No, that's absolutely correct. I want to make 2 points based on what you just said. First, the scene, so the character Shomik's talking about is named Hernan, and he is a sound engineer, and there's a scene in the first act or the second act where basically Tilda Swinton goes to his sound booth and they work together in front of a huge soundboard to try to put sounds to her words. So she tries to describe the sound in words, and he's mimicking on the sound booth in response to every tweak she's making verbally to try to mimic the sound. And I thought it was an incredible scene.
Great scene.
Just in terms of the ability of capturing how difficult it can be to sometimes use language to describe feelings or thoughts or sounds. It's an amazing scene.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the instances where the movie is just incredible. It's working in a way that no other movie, I think, works today, or no other director works today.
Yeah, and the patience of the angle of the camera work is right behind the soundboard. So when she says no this or that, as they're trying to match the sounds to recreate what she's hearing in her head, the audience has to wait for the sound. It's like incredible, the discipline of the film to that. And it actually takes probably 10 minutes. And it's really remarkable.
It's an unreal scene. It's incredible.
Yeah.
During that scene, I was like, okay, this movie is something special to a certain degree. Like
it, the wind behind it.
It was really cool. So that was the first point. The second point I want to make is that, and this gets into the third act, which I think we do really need to break down because it's so important to the movie. But the character that she meets in the third act is also named Hernan. And he's significantly older than the character who's helping her, the sound engineer character who's helping her in the second act.
Right.
But it's the same name, and they have this kind of almost primordial connection to one another.
Oh, absolutely. She's in the river. Right? And then he kind of is laying there cutting fish.
It's bizarre. It's almost like magnetic in the sense that she's just walking around and just is pulled by some sense of gravity or some force she can't describe to where he is and where he's living, right? It's almost like she's been there in a prior life, which we can talk about because I think that's kind of where the movie is going to a certain extent in the third act. So I guess the big question is, do you have an opinion as to whether or not that Hernan in the third act is the same Hernan, or a different version of that Hernan, or a copy of the Hernan from the second act? Because I think that is the connective tissue between the first two acts and the third act. And I understand entirely that it may not work because it's totally opaque still to me thinking about it a month after seeing it. But I think that is one of the keys to potentially unlocking whether or not the third act works.
It's hard to say. I mean, again, you have to really. I mean, it can't be him in the sense that there isn't any reason to indicate there's any time progression here. So if you accept almost supernatural occurrences, is this a mirror image of him or a younger version of him that she interacted before? There's no work done to create
lay that foundation. Right. There's no foundation for that, 100%.
The only thing that is interesting is this Hernan that she meets is mystical. I mean, he clearly is, they have this ability to hear each other's memories. I mean, there's this the title itself, Memoria. So whether or not this is all almost a fever dream of Tilda Swinton's and it's an unreliable narrator perspective of you could, all these things you can grasp at.
Sure.
But they don't give you a branch to pull on.
No.
You're just reading.
It's entirely speculative at this point. There's not enough in the text to justify either reading, really.
It's totally ambiguous.
Yeah.
And what I found is this, so she meets this older Hernan. They have this intense connection. He maybe dies for 10 minutes on the grass.
Unclear, but yeah.
And to hold it. The discipline of this film, they let you look at perhaps a dead man for 5 minutes. You're just sitting there in the theater and be like, what?
It's remarkable. It's the most confusing and, to my point, disorienting thing I think I've seen in a long time.
I think I heard some people in the audience like, what the hell?
Yeah.
It was really kind of, I think at that point, we were probably an hour and a half in or something.
Sure.
Getting pushed. And it ends up suggesting that he and her are telepathically connected so that she can hear his memories in her brain. And then that leads to kind of the strangest scene where it sounded like, again, this is not perfectly clear, the bang noise she's been hearing is an alien ship lifting off in the Colombian jungle.
Right.
Did I get that right?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer, but to answer you in terms of my reaction, yes, that's what I read it to be.
Because you hear the noise picking up in its frequency.
Correct.
She looks out
throughout
the window, and there's an alien ship leaving, and then overgrowth.
So it's unclear if it's ever leaving, but basically Shomik's entirely right. They have this scene out in the jungle, and then they walk into Hernan's house, and they're in a room in Hernan's house, and Tilda Swinton and Hernan are talking to each other, and they clearly are sharing the same memories. They somehow have this connective tissue that leads the viewer to believe they have experienced identical memories, despite the fact that the movie lays no foundation for them having ever met before, ever, right?
She almost hears him like a radio.
Exactly.
Right.
She's tuning him, and then they're kind of connecting, and they're saying different words, and as they're tweaking their words, they're kind of filling in the contours of the memories together to make it clear that they're talking about the same memory. And as that's happening, you hear this kind of frequency in the background, and Tilda Swinton gets up from the table where they're having this discussion and walks to the window, and she looks outside, and it's just jungle. And then a couple minutes later, presumably an alien spaceship, lifts off the jungle floor and flies away.
Yeah.
And it's unclear as to what the connection is. I mean, I think one plausible reading of the movie is that they experienced that alien spaceship when it first landed, right? Because if you listen to the memories they're talking about, it almost seems like they're describing not necessarily an abduction, but somebody coming into their house or coming into their space, right? So I think one reading of the movie is that they collectively experienced these aliens landing, and now the aliens are leaving. Now, listen, I have no idea if that's true or not. I have no idea if Tilda Swinton is in fact an alien. Maybe she came and she met this guy when they landed, or maybe she just happened to be there when they landed. It is entirely unclear, and there's no foundation or no evidence in the text to really deduce any clear reading about the ending of the movie or that scene in particular.
I totally agree. I think the alien, the way I thought of it was two ideas. One is that it's meant to suggest that in some previous time, aliens had come.
Correct. I think so.
And left. And what her Memoria, like her whatever ability to channel the memories of Hernan and maybe the place, was calling her back to it. Almost, it's like an atavistic kind of return. And whether or not the theory is, there's a rich vein in science fiction of this notion of humans not being originally from Earth. I mean, Asimov has it in his books. I mean, whether that's what they're playing at, this notion that humans came to Earth, they aren't original inhabitants, evolutionary inhabitants, and whether she's being called back to either witness the departure. There's no reason to think do we see her after the departure?
I don't believe we do, so which is why there's evidence by way of absence to indicate that she left on the spaceship.
With the ship.
For sure.
Maybe this was the whole story, if you want to take it in a simplistic way, could be, well, she just was getting called home.
Right.
And, the rest of it is kind of a misdirection, red herring. I mean, I don't know.
I actually so listen, I don't know where I land, but that's my reading of the movie.
Yeah.
Basically. My reading of the movie is that she is an alien. She came, she was there when Hernan was younger, old Hernan was younger in that place and knew him when he was younger when they first arrived. She went to try to live her life in Bogota, and for some reason or another, it didn't work, and they decided to leave. And in that respect, I think the movie actually ties pretty nicely to previous works the director has done, or to previous political statements the director has made, because I do think fundamentally the movie may also be about the difficulty in colonizing a place, right? Yeah. Which makes a lot of sense. If you're an alien, you come here and you're disoriented, right? You try to, she's a white woman in Latin America, she's trying to speak Spanish and she can kind of speak it and get by, but clearly her Spanish is not as good as the others around her. And then the spaceship fundamentally at the end of the day, it leaves. It leaves. So, I think there's a point there that
you will never be comfortable.
Exactly. You will always be disoriented. It will never be your home. Try as you may to colonize a place. It will never be your home. You can never share the experience and memories of the culture of the people who are there.
And maybe the loud bang in that way symbolizes the persistent discomfort. Like you cannot just blend in, and the bang is reminding you to go home. Like look, my concern is when I went to NYU, and there's a lot of artistic kids out there. We're workshopping into every thought-provoking exercise.
Exactly. This is a reading, but this is also kind of why I like the movie, right? Because I think more and more these days, what's being released in theaters is boilerplate Marvel typical hero journey story arcs, right? And this is a movie that refuses to do that, refuses to really give you any linear plot structure, and just it washes itself in the mystery and the feelings of a certain sense of place and emotional sentiment. And I definitely agree with you that he doesn't do sufficient work to lay down an objective reading of what happens, either in terms of story or in terms of interpretation. But I think there's enough room there, and the storytelling and filmmaking is done at a such high level that you can wrestle around in it, and there's ways to continually find meaning in the film.
The concept of Jessica as a colonizer and actually not a protagonist is very interesting.
Right.
And probably deserves another viewing just in that frame. How is he presenting her actions in the sense like, is she actually a good person here? Is she actually somebody who should be empathized with or viewed as kind of like a foreigner who's chosen Colombia to go live in, who's, not really of the place and then finally brought back? I mean, that's a very intriguing interpretation. And I think that kind of gets us to, who's this film for? And I think we were pretty unified when we talked about this and thought about it. This is not for the average film viewer. This isn't the Marvel squad. This isn't even the Argo squad. I mean, this is like really abstract.
I like that, by the way, the Argo squad. That's a great formulation of a set of cinema goers. No, I love it. 100%.
But it's that's
like quasi good, but also just like basically entertaining enough for somebody to watch.
I think this is true. This is like It's like Malik. I mean, these are films. I actually thought this was not. I'm sure this was not even in the perspective of the filmmaking team, but it reminded me of Tree of Life in certain points, in certain ways. There is obviously a dinosaur in Tree of Life. There's this kind of extreme, broad view of what's happening, the universe's creation, all to lead to a very mundane family drama, all things considered. It's for a viewer who has the time, and I mean that not in like a literal sense, like the ability and willingness to not get a payout, and instead to kind of marinate in a cinematic experience. That's what I think there are people out there. I mean, this is certainly a bit, like to your point, a better offering than most of what's made. It's just a question of is it well executed or not? Could have been done better, sure, in my view, but it's for the type of people who like to kind of leave and think about it for a few.
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely. This is about as art house gets in terms of films, or basically in terms of any type of art. I think it, to a certain degree, can be impenetrable for a lot of viewers. And we just kind of workshop some potential interpretations or meaning during the podcast. And I think folks who don't like doing that or haven't, been English majors or whatever, philosophy majors, or watched a lot of movies or really thought a lot about narrative interpretation, I don't necessarily know if it's going to be an enjoyable movie, because a lot of the enjoyment I get out of it is not only feeling, there's definitely a great sense of feeling a certain emotional feeling while you're watching the movie, but just as much enjoyment comes from kind of wrestling with the themes and what's going on in the movie. And if you're a film goer who doesn't like to spend time doing that, I don't necessarily think it's a good film to spend your time on.
Yeah. And so I guess following up on that, the question that we're going to ask for every film we talk about is, what's one way you can make the movie better? And you can start, Luke. I think people will guess what I'm going to say.
So I think one way, and this is an easy way, is just make it a little bit shorter, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean cutting more. I don't think you need to cut specific scenes into shorter scenes, right? Like the scenes that are 10 minutes long in the jungle, those need to be 10 minutes to do what they're doing. But I think there are certain scenes that just don't need to be in the movie, right? You mentioned earlier the jazz band scene where Tilda Swinton is basically
so indulgent.
She's going to find the sound engineer Hernan, so the younger Hernan, and she's walking around. She can't find him. He seemingly has vanished. And she walks into a college room, and there's just an ensemble band playing jazz. And basically the camera moves from her face to the jazz band and just watches the jazz band play jazz for, over a minute or two. And like, cool, it's kind of, in some way, I guess it's beautiful or interesting, but definitely not beautiful or interesting enough that it needed to be in the movie, especially when you're already working on a movie that's over 2 hours and that is going to alienate some people just in terms of how opaque or difficult it will be.
I think that's absolutely right. And I would put the scene where older Hernan maybe dies. I mean, again, whatever he's trying to accomplish, you don't need to actually sit there. Yes, you get put in a place. I totally agree. I would also add the scene where older Hernan maybe dies there. Again, if you want to convey Tilda Swinton's feeling of displacement, uncertainty of what's occurring, this new person that's shown up, you can do all that, but you don't need me clocking in at already we're at 2 hours to sit through this interminable, because I think at some point you just want to move. And so I agree with you there. Length, though, for me, would have been okay if the payoff was there.
Sure.
Because I think we both share the sentiment. There is a real meaning and value to the commitment to the long shots, the commitment to the broad storylines, the commitment to the expanse of the film that I think could have huge value, but the plot needs to come in. And this is something you'll hear me say, the plot to me is the most important, because otherwise, this is like, it's abstractions. I mean, the story, the third act needed to give us the answer to what is the predicament. To look back until
so this quote.
What is the predicament?
And what is the solution potentially too?
Is
or the lack thereof.
Is it climate? Is it whatever it is? You need to give that answer, because otherwise you come out feeling like you've seen something you're not sure what it means, but you don't actually think about the thing that I'm sure the director wanted it to be. So you can think about it as a thought experiment. If the director wanted this to be a film about climate change, he didn't accomplish his goal. because I haven't been properly focused in on that.
Sure.
If the only thing he wanted to show was people can be very confused at times in life, okay, well, that's fine. But I imagine there's more, everything suggests there is. I think that's where the discipline to the storyline, ambiguity is good, but it needs to be ambiguity for a purpose as opposed as a party trick.
Right.
Someone I worked with in graphic design who once said that, minimalism is good as long as it's not a laziness. Right? You didn't want to do too much work because it's minimalist.
Right.
That doesn't work. Same thing with plots. Like, bare bones is fine, but it has to serve a purpose and be intentional, not kind of, we'll leave it up to the viewer. But like, what are you trying to convey here? I didn't get that from the story. So for me, the one thing I would fix is the director and Tilda Swinton articulate through the film better what is the predicament that Jessica's in, and what are they trying to expose as something that's off kilter that leads her to this journey she embarks on.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair critique. And just to follow up, I love the minimalism quote, and just to follow up with another artistic and I guess writing-based metaphor. And this is on the spot, so if it doesn't work, forgive me for stretching too far. But Hemingway is a famous minimalist, right? And the idea is it's the iceberg story, right? You only write what's on the top, which is a very small piece, but you write it clearly enough and powerfully enough such that the viewer or the reader in this case immediately feels what's under the water, right? The bottom of the iceberg. And I think in this movie, that's clearly what's going on because it is largely an abstraction up top. But the problem is, once you get below the water with this film, there's not a clear delineation of the iceberg, right? So there's not even a framework or a boundary in which you can kind of wrestle. It's just wide open ocean below, right? There's just not enough filled in to give you any kind of place to look or any type of boundary within which to work. It's just not explained at all. So basically, you end the movie with ambiguity, but no sense of even a potential reading or a potential way to end the movie, right? Typically, an ambiguous ending set like, okay, the person's either dead or alive, right? And we don't know if they're dead or alive. That's a little bit rudimentary. There are other ambiguous endings where maybe there are 3 or 4 possibilities of what happens. In this case, it seems like there's infinite possibilities, right? Like there's infinite possibilities of what's going on in this third act of the film. And I think in that sense, you're right to say if you could have kind of reeled it in a little bit to give it a little bit more structure, I think it would have helped everybody involved in terms of the people watching.
And that's where you'll see, this show is going to oftentimes divert from critical sentiment. Everyone's kind of, I've surveyed a lot of the analyses. A lot of people came to that conclusion, but they were deferential and said basically like, this is intentionalized. I think the burden should be higher, but in the end, one of the things we're always going to end up asking before we conclude is, what do you see this as a part of some broader cinematographic lineage of film? And more importantly, are there pairings, things you think that a viewer who liked it might want to go watch as well and look forward to? I mean, I've already said kind of what I think. I was, for better or for worse, called back to Tree of Life. The Malik, that opening 30 minutes of Tree of Life I love that film, by the way. And I think that might be an example of how you can do what, a big concept in a pretty otherwise mundane drama. Well, and I was reminded of the magical realism. I mean, the authors there in the sense of like this concept where there's fluidity to almost the generalized accepted parameters of the, existence. Whether it's, that she is going through this phenomena, or there's disappearing people, maybe made up people, there's, the ability to telepathically connect, etc. All of that to me seemed to be, the fact that it's set in Latin America seemed to be a call out to magical realism and almost an homage to it, perhaps. But I know, Luke, you thought it was very close to a film by Shane Carruth, Upstream Color. So, if you want to tell the audience about what your view was on how it's similar to that and how you think it might be in that lineage.
Sure. So first, let me say I agree. I think that Malik is a great call. Tree of Life is a great call. I didn't really give much thought to magical realism. I didn't have that thought, but I also think it's fantastic, especially given the Garcia Marquez connection to Colombia. Exactly. I mean, it's a great point. So I think of kind of two potential pairings here. We'll get to Upstream Color in a second because in some ways it's very different, but in some ways it's similar. I think the first, as I mentioned, is Tarkovsky. You know, I haven't seen a lot of Tarkovsky stuff. I think I've only seen 2 of his films, but formally, it's very similar in the sense that there's a patience, there's a restraint, there's almost an excessive holding on shots, so very long shots. In that sense, and I don't know Joe's influences or if he's spoken on this at all, but I would not be surprised at all if he's a fan of Tarkovsky. There's a lot of kind of formal similarities there in terms of the way they set a frame, hold a frame. Now, Upstream Color is interesting because formally speaking, Upstream Color couldn't be more different than this movie. It's tons of close-ups. It's tons of quick cuts. It's incredibly disorienting because of that purpose. So it's similarly disorienting, but it gets at the disorientation from a totally different style of filmmaking and formal approach to editing. So in that way, it's just totally different. And people are going to hear me say Upstream Color may be similar and think I'm a fucking jackass, which is fair because it is incredibly different in terms of the watching experience and the formal approach. But when we get to substance and themes, I think Upstream Color is very similar here because like Jessica and Old Turn On in the end, the movie is about 2 people who went through very similar experiences separately, but then met each other later in the movie and are collectively trying to unravel memories about those experiences. And while they're doing that, a connective tissue grows between the 2 people. Now, in Upstream Color, it's a romantic relationship, but the principle is basically the same, right? Which is somebody had this incredibly horrific, disorienting thing happen to them, and flash forward a few years and they meet somebody and they have this kind of strange connection with this person and they don't really know why. It just kind of happens. And then as the relationship progresses, it starts to become clear that they had root experiences that were almost identical. But the memory about those experiences is vague and blurry. So they're kind of collectively trying to work through it in a way that is very similar to the third act, I think, of what happens in Memoria. And also, it's a science fiction movie. So the third act in Memoria obviously introduces some science fiction themes with the introduction of the spaceship. So I think there are some substantive and thematic connections between that film and this one. And I think if you like storytelling about blurred memories and fragmented memories and the difficulty that comes with processing reality through those types of memories, I think it maybe will be an enjoyable watch for viewers.
Tarkovsky's a great call too. You know, Mirror people famously have no idea what it was about. But it was, you know,
not only Mirror, I feel like a lot of his movies.
Solaris, Stalker.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, look, the takeaway is if you like challenging, complex riddles of films that may not ultimately have an answer, and you really are looking for a different cinematic experience than what you normally get, it's I think recommended viewing. You know, I think it's ultimately maybe a frustrating experience, but if you have the time, worthwhile one.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think riddles is a good word. I particularly like the phrasing you used earlier in the show, which is abstractions. It's really, it's a visual and sonic abstraction. And if that's the type of experience you'd like to have or wrestle with, I think it's going to be an enjoyable one for you.